But right now, it's also clear that this collection is trying to talk about very specific personal events that Milo has very specific personal feelings about. Feelings that he wants the reader to also have. But for whatever reason, he's not willing to show us the details, perhaps because he knows he can't have full control over whether the reader will actually have his desired reaction to these details. But you have to let go of control in poetry if you're going to publish it. It's almost like these poems give us just enough access, they let us inside to then trap us in this box of emotional labels. So, Milo Winter, previously known as Audra Winter, the fantasy author who was involved in one of the biggest Booktok dramas of 2025, has published a collection of poetry. Now, I've been following the Milo Winter drama relatively closely. If you haven't heard of him, well, first of all, how's that rock you're living under? Does it kind of have a homey vibe, or are you still getting it furnished? Just to summarize, this young fantasy author, Milo Winter, is writing a book, and he blows up on TikTok with a delectable combination of pity marketing.
I'm losing to the TikTok algorithm.
And boss bitch energy.
I literally became the owner of a 6-figure business in the period of that 2 weeks. Thank you.
And he ends up getting thousands of pre-sales for his book, Age of Scorpius. Then the book comes out, and it is received very, very poorly. Now, Milo starts lashing out at these reviews, implying that his editors are partially to blame for the book's quality. And the internet turns on him completely. People were demanding refunds. They were accusing him of fleeing the country for tax evasion, okay? It got unhinged. And while it was certainly a car crash that I couldn't look away from, I never felt compelled to comment on it because fantasy is just not a genre that I read. I'm a chronic poet. Thanks for your condolences. Which means that I exclusively read, write, publish, and honestly think about poetry. So I wasn't about to pretend to be as enraged as everyone else was about how bad this book was when I didn't even read it. That's just not something I can do in good faith. But then he did something unexpected and dropped a poetry collection called Alterlife, and I said, now this is something I can get overly invested in. Welcome back to my channel, and if you are new, hi, my name is Danae Young. Links to my published poetry down in the description of this video, so check that out if you're interested. I was really curious to see how this poetry collection was going to be received, because sometimes a writer's style and voice just show more promise within the framework of poetry than in a novel. Part of Milo's essay that he released in response to the internet turning on him was this extended metaphor about forest fires, which, while I took issue with some of its execution, I was like, oh, that is one of the symptoms of being a poet, is the urge to weave these overly extended metaphors into your prose that people usually just end up being confused by. I was also noticing when looking at the reactions to this book of poetry that some people were still so focused on the drama surrounding Age of Scorpius, which I get, okay, it was compelling. But I found myself wishing that more people were actually reviewing and analyzing the poetry rather than just reiterating that Milo is a bad author. Quick disclaimer for my regular viewers, if you haven't already noticed, this is going to be a bit of a different format than my other content. I am going to be leaving most of my editing and dry humor at the door. Most of it. And mainly just talking about this book and the public's response to it. Now, criticism that I kept seeing come up in terms of what makes this book bad is that, just like Age of Scorpius, the writing was confusing. I've even seen some people make the argument that Milo's writing in this collection proves that he didn't listen at all to the feedback that he received about Age of Scorpius. Keep in mind that readers critiqued Age of Scorpius for its plot holes, its narrative inconsistencies, and its borderline incorrect grammar. Now, after having read it, do I think that lack of clarity in this collection is a major issue? Yes. However, what it means to be confusing in a poetry collection is completely different than what it means to be confusing in a novel. Because the idea of narrative, the idea of consistency, and the contract between the author and the reader in terms of clarity is going to look completely different, especially depending on what type of poetry you're trying to write. The public response to this book of poetry really got me thinking about the way ambiguity functions in poetry. You see, respected modern poets like Carl Phillips, Harmony Holiday, Dana Smith, far from prioritize accessibility and clarity in their poetry. Hell, there is an entire movement called post-structuralism in poetry that decenters the direct communication of clear and precise ideas from author to reader, and instead thinks of the poem as a sort of prompt to allow the reader to invent their own meaning. Even something like grammar or syntax, which I know people took issue with across both of Milo's projects, could potentially operate completely differently or even in direct opposition to the rules of the English language within a poem. Much like poems don't really have to follow narrative logic, they also don't really have to follow grammatical logic either. I know, poets are really lawless individuals. I have no defense. You theoretically can break any rule in poetry in a way that you can't really get away with in prose most of the time. But, and this is the issue with Milo's collection, there needs to be a reason behind it. That's why I think it's important to examine why these elements aren't working specifically within this collection and not be vague about what labels we put onto the book. Like, imagine if I said that what makes Rupi Kaur's work so bad is the opposite, that it's too obvious, its meaning is too instantly accessible and easy to understand. That would really be an insufficient explanation, right? Because there are plenty of great poems that I instantly understand. The vast majority of haiku, you could say, fall under this umbrella. So it has less to do with her poetry being simple and easy to understand, and actually entirely to do with why it is so easy to instantly understand. The reason being that there is no surprise, creativity, or attempt to play with language via poetic devices, making it thus unoriginal and very boring to read. The same cannot be said about a good haiku. These oversimplifications when it comes to discussing authors and texts we dislike makes me think of the shift that I've noticed in book-related discourse online, where it seems like a lot of people aren't as interested in showing their work, in explaining specifically why a literary text didn't do it for them, and instead are far more fascinated by the drama surrounding the text and the author. Let me tell you something, okay? Roland Barthes would be rolling in his grave if he knew that social media virality was going to be that bitch who resurrects the author and reinstates them as the centerpiece that overshadows literary criticism. Don't get it twisted. I'm all for honest literary critiques, negative ones included. And I believe that people didn't like Alterlife, well, especially after having read it, for valid reasons. But then let's talk about those reasons with the care and specificity that we give other books. And I did see a couple videos doing this sort of analysis, but I just wish there were more. Saying that Milo Winter is a bad poet and Alterlife is confusing and that it just proves that he's the terrible writer that everyone knew him to be, but not actually providing examples and analysis from the text itself, instead using these sort of vague descriptors for the book as a whole, it isn't actually helpful to anyone. Not only is it kind of trying to disguise itself as constructive feedback, but it also does nothing to help other young or beginner poets try to improve their writing and avoid some of the choices that make Milo's poetry ineffective. So, let's get into the review. When I took this book out of my mailbox, I was actually pretty surprised at how thin it was. I did not look at the page count before I purchased it. Now, some people may be more likely to see this as a negative, but to me, when a poet that I haven't read before and hasn't published anything comes out with a collection of 200 pages of poetry, it's actually more of a red flag to me. It kind of indicates that maybe they didn't choose the best poems out of the ones that they had and kind of just threw all of them in there. It's kind of how I feel about albums with likely track lists as well. Now, when I actually opened the book and started reading it, did the poems that Milo chose actually feel like they went through a process of weeding out and revising and editing down? Well, no, but let's get into it. So immediately with a lot of the poems, I noticed that Milo was experimenting with form. This always intrigues me. I love me some well thought out, visually experimental poetry. Simultaneously though, it makes me proceed with caution as a reader, because I wonder if the poem's content is going to actually justify its form. Sometimes writers will try to take advantage of how lawless poetry is and grab the attention of the reader to try and distract them from the actual language of the poem that maybe isn't strong enough to stand on its own. And just to be clear, they could be consciously doing this, or it could be indicative of an underlying insecurity that they have about their own writing. Trust me, I've been there. Okay, she's come a long way. Let's look at the opening poem as an example, The Canine and the Core. On a very surface level, I see why Milo thought that this sort of form was a good idea considering the content of the poem. There's a lot of imagery of fire and destruction, and I think it's interesting how the poem starts out as this block of prose, and the shortening of the lines sort of visually represent this deterioration as you venture further into the poem. The font change at the end feels very gimmicky to me, but that might just be a personal preference. That said, again, I think of form as a structural support. If the visual form is doing more heavy lifting than the actual language of the poem, then that's, well, I'll say difficult to pull off. Notice how you're not going to hear me say this never works or you actively shouldn't do this, because I believe there's always exceptions in a genre as fluid as poetry. So looking at the language of this poem and the language in many of the poems of this collection, this opening poem has a motif of fire and burning, and it is clear that the speaker is being hunted in some way. But in terms of Milo's lack of clarity in his writing, I do notice three main choices that end up reappearing throughout the collection. Now, these choices independently aren't necessarily a problem, and I wouldn't even say they're uncommon in poetry. They can be done well. However, it is the execution and combination of these three approaches that I really think ends up unintentionally muddling his writing and creating that sort of confusion that people keep referencing. The first is that Milo often tries to pull off these very extended, sometimes multi-tiered metaphors. And by multi-tiered, I mean that instead of comparing two things, which is the OG structure of a metaphor, Milo sometimes loops in a third or fourth thing to this comparison and tries to juggle these simultaneously. In the canine and the core, Milo wants the speaker to be represented by a wolf, writing my paws, my muzzle, a creature escaping a forest. But his language also suggests that the speaker/wolf is represented by a third thing, the fire itself. Quote, my cinder coat, paws of ash. Here, he muddles the metaphor, especially since the wolf is meant to be running from the fire. Now, I know it's completely plausible that with this imagery, Milo meant to convey that the metaphorical wolf/speaker's paws are covered in ash, and that its fur is covered in cinders. But this is an example of how syntactical clarity really matters. When you write paws of ash, as a reader, I'm going to think there's a reason that you wrote it that way, instead of saying that the paws were covered in ash. Here, ash becomes the material of which the paws are made. Similarly, the speaker doesn't say that their fur is coated in cinder. They call it a cinder coat as a descriptor for the wolf/the speaker. See how the language sets up, either directly or through implication, these additional comparisons that I think aren't always thought out or consistent. Take the poem Eat My Young as another example. The speaker says, quote, I feast on naivety and lick the blood off its bones, which is an interesting enough image, I think, one that compares naivety to the body of a dead animal. However, when we get to the final stanza, it's revealed that not only is this naivety a dead animal that the speaker feasts on, but is also a metaphor for both the speaker's own spirit and for a runt in the wolf pack. Now, it could be argued that the runt is just a clarification for what type of dead animal it is, but my point still stands. There are still three things being compared here. Now, even with all of this juggling of figurative language, I still believe poetry using this sort of web of metaphorical comparisons can be effective if other choices were made in constructing the rest of the poem. But here's the thing, when you look to the text for clarification, Milo's grammar and syntax, rather than doing the work of convincing us of the connections between these different images and ideas, instead obfuscate them even more. In poems like Eat My Young, lines like, I am obsessed with restarting, comma, frailty and fortress, not only sound disjointed, but just bring us further away from the ideas that Milo's trying to set up. The comma indicates that the phrase frailty and fortress is somehow connected to the idea of the speaker's obsession with restarting, but how? Frailty, though a noun, refers to a state of being, but fortress is a physical location. So putting these two words on the same line is an odd choice. When you're playing with extended metaphors that compare more than two things, you usually are going to need clear syntax that the reader can hold on to balance out that ambiguity. Which leads into my next point, the second technique that Milo is using, which is his disjointed grammar and syntax. And how in this specific collection, they actually just further obfuscate the poetic devices that Milo is so fond of using. Take, for example, the first stanza in this poem, Tundra Aurora. Notice how in the first three lines, the grammar is clear. The speaker, I, is the subject, which is then followed by a series of predicates. The speaker has learned. The speaker is desperate. The speaker is grasping. After that, however, the grammar gets disrupted. Notice how in each of these three lines, his sentence structure wants to prioritize comparison. Alike, as, like, are the first words in each of these three lines, but the lack of clear subject in the sentence obfuscates what we're actually comparing here. And here's the issue for me. How are these grammatical choices trading in some level of clarity for a chance to deepen the meaning of the poem, which is the only instance where I believe it's acceptable to have this sort of disjointed language. And so grammatical experimentation here, whether intentional or accidental, isn't actually doing the work of showing us the complexities of these metaphors or convincing us that they're not sloppy. Take E.E. Cummings's Anyone Lived in a Pretty How Town as an example of a poet using incorrect and straight up confusing syntax, actually to the benefit of the poem. I'm about to show it on screen. Okay, so brace yourselves, it might be a bit of a jump scare. This poem is very strange, okay, as you can probably see, and it reads almost like a riddle because of how unfamiliar the sentence structure is. It follows the story of a man named No One who falls in love with a woman named Anyone in a town where nothing ever happens and everything is forgotten. And once the lovers die, they too are forgotten just like everything else. Cheery. I'm starting to think E. Cummings may have been a nihilist, but that's just a wild guess. But my point is, the bizarre language in this poem captures an overwhelming sense of anonymity. The syntax tells the story of two individuals who fall in love, but in all the places where we expect specificity from a sentence, it actually withholds anything that is even remotely personal or specific. Instead, using auxiliary words like is and didn't, words that are stripped of meaning pretty much without their grammatical contexts. Quote, he sang his didn't, he danced his did. It's not that he didn't sing and he did dance. It's that he sang something and he danced something else. But the poem won't tell us what, and instead gives us a very grammatically unsatisfying answer. Stanza 2 reads, quote, women and men, both little and small, cared for anyone, not at all. They sowed their isn't, they reaped their same. Sun, moon, stars, rain. The rare moments of imagery we get are almost satirically unspecific. The sun, the moon, the stars, and the rain are straight up caricatures of vague, cliche imagery in poetry. On top of that, pretty much every one of these vague actions is paired with its undoing, making each line and ultimately the idea of syntax altogether completely inconsequential, just like the town. These people, their love, and the town as a whole was always going to be something that was lost to memory and time. So returning to Alterlife, the problem in the context of poetry, again, is not that the syntax is disjointed and confusing, but the fact that it is needlessly so. It seems to be more accidental than intentional, especially considering the negative effects it has on our understanding of Milo's metaphors. Now, the third major misstep that I think Milo makes in his poetry, and I think this is honestly the biggest one, is Milo's habit of labeling and diagnosing his own writing. Let me explain what I mean by that. Milo uses a lot of broad, intangible constructs that are trying to tell us how to feel about the poem. I mean, within this one opening poem, you have slow violence, reflections of hopeless love, terror tucked, down to the word disturbance. He uses these words to almost categorize his own poems as violent or terrifying or hopeless, rather than being able to make us feel those things authentically. And I'm not a fan of this sort of broad language in poetry generally, but I also recognize that just like disjointed grammar, it can be done well. But it's the combination of all of these three choices that Milo has made that creates this confusion. One where we are getting these multi-tiered metaphors and loud images that we're told are meant to convey a sense of danger and the speaker's literal victimization. But we don't often get an explanation for why the speaker is literally victimized. The syntax doesn't give us any hints. The metaphors are often grounded through other metaphors instead of literal details. And so we're just told we're meant to feel this way. And so it's not that Alterlife isn't literal or clear enough per se, it's that it wants to have the best of both worlds. Milo doesn't ground his metaphors in a clear, literal meaning. His disruptive syntax only serves to further prevent us from orienting ourselves, but he also isn't willing to give up interpretive control to the reader in a way that a post-structuralist writer would. He isn't willing to allow the piece to live outside of the world and perspective he's envisioned for it. He needs the reader to know that when they read the canine in the core, They should feel this inescapable, life-consuming violence that the speaker is running from. The poem and the images are all confined to Milo's own value judgments on the subject matter, and yet he isn't willing to give the reader the specifics of the subject matter to reach that emotional conclusion themselves. Wolfwalker does a better job at including literal details, but it doesn't mesh them with the figurative language. It's more so like the first 3/4 of it are literal, and then it devolves into the same sort of crutch that Milo has been using. Quote, "The force of this land taught me how to overcome my fears of disaster. Lesson and love will always exist amidst chaos. I thanked the river for the floods of change. I forgave her for teaching me that the most beautiful forms of life are as dangerous as they are admirable." It's almost like these poems give us just enough access. They let us inside to then trap us in this box of emotional labels. There's little to no light. We can, barely see. We can only just sort of vaguely feel the walls surrounding us, keeping us contained in these vague abstract concepts like violence and the victimization of the speaker. So what revision would I suggest? Listen, accessibility to the true meaning of a poem is going to be prioritized differently depending on who you are as an individual. It's a stylistic difference that varies widely across the work of successful and respected poets. As I said in the beginning, just as there are incredibly accessible poems that are executed well and ones that are executed poorly, the same goes for incredibly inaccessible poems. And that's why I'm not comfortable saying that what this collection objectively needs is more clear, literal details, even though my preference as a reader would be to incorporate even a few of these types of lines in some of these poems. Just a few though. Don't go overboard. Y'all who've been watching my channel know I like to be a little bit perplexed on first read through of a poem. But it's never even remotely my intention to change the authentic style of a poet. It's merely to refine the execution. It's clear even looking at some of Milo's other writings, such as his essay High Disturbance, that his inclination as a writer is to use nature and natural disasters as these extended, sometimes multi-tiered metaphors for the intense emotions of the individual. It's evident that he likes to write in this figurative sort of space a lot of the time. And my suggestion is not to turn away from this instinct, especially as he continues to find his voice as a writer. But right now, it's also clear that this collection is trying to talk about very specific personal events that Milo has very specific personal feelings about. Feelings that he wants the reader to also have. But for whatever reason, he's not willing to show us the details, perhaps because he knows he can't have full control over whether the reader will actually have his desired reaction to these details. But you have to let go of control in poetry if you're going to publish it. So make a decision to either let the reader in on the specifics of the situation, show us what the fire symbolizes, show us why the wolf is hunted, or allow your poetry to live outside of yourself altogether and let go of the emotional value judgments you're currently trying to project onto the reader. That's gonna be it for this video. If you enjoyed this video essay yap session hybrid, consider dropping a like. It really helps people see my content, my channel, and consider subscribing for anything and everything poetry related. I will see you guys next time.